Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Taylor Frizzell. I'm the IAEM Region 1 Vice President and Massachusetts State Representative. I know we're all super busy, so we appreciate you taking some time out for this really exciting webinar. Scott's a really great guy. He has a lot of information and super looking forward to this presentation. Before we get started today, I just want to go through a few little housekeeping things. So some background on IAEM for those of you who don't know. We're an international organization supporting and promoting emergency managers to be better emergency managers, right? And so at a regional level, we do that through things like these monthly webinars, which, we're always looking for more presentations. So if you do, if you yourself are interested or if you know someone else who might be, please feel free to send us a message. We also do monthly training updates, and we compile the updates for all of the New England states. We compile those and send them out on a monthly basis, or you can find them on the members only page. We also do support of legislation as it relates to emergency managers and emergency management, which is very exciting. And we also do a lot of things around situational awareness, social media, promoting different events around the region. So we encourage you to follow us on Facebook, and if you're not already a member, to look into that as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to read Scott's bio real quick. So he is the Global Head of Workplace Violence Risk Management at Takeda Pharmaceuticals in Cambridge, Mass. So they are a global bio-pharma company with over 60,000 employees and 400 plus office locations. Scott has extensive experience in both public and private sector and in both security management and law enforcement. He started his career with the United States Air Force, where he served in the security forces career field. During his career, he worked as a law enforcement patrolman, criminal investigator, flight commander, nuclear weapons convoy commander, air base defense officer, and operations officer. Next, Scott was the Director of Protective Services at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and just prior to his current position, he was Vice President and Regional Security Manager for State Street Corporation in Boston, Mass. In this role, he led their Safe Workplace Program, Travel Risk Management, Executive Protection Program, and Security Operations for sites across the Americas region. He's a certified protection professional and is currently studying for the Certified Threat Manager exam through ACAP. He's got a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a master's in business administration. Like I said, he knows his stuff. So thank you guys so much for joining us today for Scott's presentation on threat management fundamentals. So Scott, I will go ahead and toss this over to you.
Hi, thank you, Taylor. And thanks for having me today. I know this is a subject probably a little off on, I don't know if I want to say on the fringe, but a little different than what IAEM normally deals with. So it's something I do every day, and appreciate that you're looking at including this. Especially, thank you to you for including me during this current time, and I'm glad for you to do this when we're also focused on the pandemic, that we're taking the time to keep our other skills sharp and think about other things as well to keep everything else going. And I'll note that today I'm speaking as an individual, and all the thoughts and ideas are my own, not those of Takeda or of IAEM. And finally, I'll just say that I don't sit here telling you I'm an expert in this area. I'm always skeptical when I hear folks say they're an expert, because I think there's so much to learn. I come to you today with a better than average understanding of this work, and I know where to go for things, and I sometimes know what I don't know. So I hope to share some great information and point you in the right direction today. So here's the agenda. I use the term threat management as I think it best describes what we need to be doing. It encompasses the whole life cycle of a threat from the time you recognize it until you have it resolved and extinguished. You can't simply make the threat go away, you have to manage it. So to that end, today we're going to talk about threat management and the process of identifying, assessing, and managing threats. I'm going to go through some key components or concepts that make up threat management. We'll talk about the components of a thorough threat management program. And then I'll give you some resources and information where you can go to learn more about this and to help guide your programs. And finally, we'll wrap up and I'll try to answer your questions. And you'll probably also likely tell me what I missed, which is great. because that's what the collaboration is all about, and I hope to learn some from that too today. So what is threat management? Threat management is the process of identifying threats early, assessing the level of risk at that time, and then creating an active and dynamic management plan. So that process is identify the threats. So that's, you have to know what's going on. So those are your training programs and information coming in from employees, and then being able to assess that to say, what's the danger to us at this time? Do we need to act right away? How much time do we have to investigate? All of that. And then, the biggest portion is managing that threat. It's active and dynamic. It varies from case to case and person to person, and it cannot be a cookie cutter approach. You recognize that everything you do changes the case, the threat, and your future actions. So when we're dealing with a case of workplace violence, as soon as you step in and speak to the employee who's making the threats or who you feel is a threat, you've changed the situation. If they know that you spoke to the victim, you changed the situation. If you take an employment action or legal action, or you've changed the situation. So that's what threat management's all about. And then I'll note too that we're going to talk about threat assessment. Sometimes folks talking broadly might interchange those, but threat assessment is part of threat management. So, and more to that, everything else aside, our goal is to keep employees safe, and nothing else matters. It's about safety. And it's not always about being right. That's something traditionally most companies, security, legal, HR, when we're dealing with this, we always want to be right. And we tend to get into the mindset of right and wrong. In threat management, sometimes being right doesn't matter. Being safe is what matters. Yes, you're right that they're not due the vacation pay that they're claiming when they've exited the organization. And yes, you're right, they should return the company computer. But if people fear for their safety and the sticking point is the return of a $1,000 computer, is it better to be right or safe? I'll tell you that each case may require a different solution, and you have to ask what actions will work for this case to retain our safety. And also think about what is winning in their mind. So what is that person looking for to feel better, to de-escalate, and to move on? What is their sticking point? And then how can you get comfortable with meeting them at that point? And always think win-win, again, because it's about safety, not about being right. And, further to that, I've seen cases where companies will make severance payments, and that's always a hard one to swallow. But it might be a larger severance payment that you normally wouldn't. Instinct says, no, they've done something, they've made threatening statements, we're terminating them, so we're not going to do that. Absolutely not. But companies that do this well at least consider that, and they might make a severance payment, and they might stretch it out, over 4 quarters of a year, so that that person is waiting for that to come in, and they're not going to do anything because they know that that next payment's coming, and it at least gives you a longer bit of time to monitor them, but also a longer piece of time that they can get their other issues resolved and move on. So again, that's just one tactic for you to try and keep your employees safe. Actually, I'm going to go back. So finally, think about cases in terms of active or inactive versus open or closed. When you terminate an employee, the threat doesn't just go away, so you don't close it. It may become inactive and calls for some intermittent follow-up. For example, social media checks to see how they're doing. So I hate the term close because to me that says it's done. And if I've gone inactive, or I may consider it active even though the employee left, but we're going to check weekly, monthly, and just check back in and see how they're doing. And I'll say that many companies are too quick to terminate. If you have a true threat and you go straight to termination, you may immediately lose the visibility on this person and any administrative control you once had. And this may be the right choice, but it should be thoughtfully considered before taking that action. And know that once you do that, your threat management environment has changed, and you lose a lot of visibility on that person. And finally, workplace violence cases are like people. Each one may need to be managed a little differently and always requires your attention. So getting into the foundations and key concepts, we'll talk about workplace violence and its impact. And workplace violence is not just gun violence. And that's a common misperception that you'll see all over. When you say workplace violence, people picture shootings. They think about shootings. According to the ASIS-SHRM Workplace Violence Prevention and Intervention Standard, workplace violence is a spectrum of behaviors including overt acts of violence, threats, and other conduct that generates a reasonable concern for safety from violence, where a nexus exists between the behavior and the physical safety of employees and others on-site or off-site when related to the organization. So workplace violence is all those behaviors. It's someone with an angry outburst in the workplace. It might be nonverbal things that someone's doing that make someone else feel unsafe. It's a whole spectrum, up to and including physical violence, gun violence, that sort of thing. So how big is the problem? We know that about 2 million American workers report they're victims of workplace violence every year. In 2017, workplace assaults resulted in 18,400 injuries and 458 fatalities. We know that victims of workplace violence lose about 1.8 million workdays per year, and the cost to employers is estimated at nearly 121 billion annually. And then add to that lost productivity, turnover, employee stress, anxiety, et cetera. And it's a pretty big problem. And I think it's safe to say that every single organization deals with this. When we consider that broad definition, every organization deals with it at some level. And we've all had someone in the workplace, maybe right now, that's aggressive, angry, demanding. No one wants to work with them. Some people avoid talking to them, working with them. I'd ask, does this affect the work being done? Does it cause fear in coworkers, make them uncomfortable? This is workplace violence. And then finally on this, I'll say that, and I'm guessing you're all familiar with the OSHA duty of care. And that says that if there's a threat to an employee that you can reasonably predict, then you have the duty to protect them. And I think it's safe to say that, and well established, that workplace violence is a threat that we all should be prepared to combat and be prepared for, because it does happen often enough. So we do have a duty of care. Taylor or Chelsea, before I go on to the next slide, am I okay? Any questions?
I don't necessarily have a question, but I think that you're bringing up some excellent points here. I think that one of the things that, we kind of forget about when we go through our day-to-days in the office is that this is relevant regardless of the size of the organization, right? You can work a small company with 5 people or at a massive pharmaceutical company, right, that similar to where you're working, right? And I think that that's something that we kind of overlook. A lot of people get into that mindset of thinking, well, there's only 10 people at this company, so it's not something that I have to worry about. None of us are going to become disgruntled. And so I think that that's an excellent point. I think that that's something that people would do well to remember. And I also think it's great that, you're adding a human component to it. It's not, it's great that there's information about ways to build out a program, but at the end of the day, it's just kind of, checking in on the people around you, right? And I know you'll go more in depth into the steps, but it's definitely a human piece of emergency management that we don't necessarily take into consideration when writing out our plans and whatever else,
Yeah, for sure. And it absolutely happens at company at all sizes. And I'd say probably in a smaller company, if it's only 10 people, you're more isolated and you probably don't have far to go or, less options to get away from that situation or that person. And sometimes in such a small group, it's harder to speak up and say, hey, this is a problem, when the manager's right there, or maybe the owner of their company and they're there and they see it and they're not doing anything. So do you speak up and say something? And to your other point, absolutely. I have said, for years, I stress engagement, and that by talking about this, we're making it a better workplace. We're making people, for the person that's maybe acting aggressively, they probably have some reason they're doing that and something they're having trouble with. And when someone sits down and says, hey, Scott, I noticed you've been aggravated lately. How's that project? Can I help you with it? And I might say, wow, I didn't realize I was doing that. Yeah, I'd love some help. Thanks. And we made the situation better for them as well as us, and we made it safer. So it's all about engagement. Thank you. So the next term, or foundation, is behaviors of concerns, or you hear them called concerning behaviors. So these are the things we look for. So the definition would be a broad range of observed reported behaviors falling along a spectrum that, due to their nature and or severity, significantly affect the workplace, generate a concern for personal safety, or result in physical injury or death. So these are, you could say these are indicators of potential threats. They can be increasingly erratic, unsafe, or aggressive behaviors, hostile feelings of injustice or perceived wrongdoing. And when we talk about mass shooters, you'll hear the term injustice collector. That's someone that always feels like if it's raining today, it's not just raining, it's raining on them. It's because of them. It's, they're the target. But we talk about drug and or alcohol abuse, marginalization or distancing from friends and colleagues, changes in work performance, sudden and dramatic changes in home life and in personality, financial difficulties, pending civil or criminal litigation, and observable grievances with threats and plans of retributions. And again, with mass shooters, most begin with some unresolved grievance. And with all of those, we're looking for all those things, but specifically we're looking for changes. Someone that, their work performance has changed recently. They have legal issues that have just come upon them, and many times it's these things that build up and they don't have the coping mechanisms to deal with them, and things sort of build up, and finally they collapse with it, and then you have a problem. So, I think in all of these things, some sort of engagement. At my last company, I used to always say that if we talk about this stuff and engage and things, and we engage one-on-one and in small work groups or with the manager, the better we do at that, the less things get reported to security and HR and need to be handled at that level. Because for anyone, if I'm having some problems and maybe I'm being aggressive because the stress has got me, it's better for me too if it can be handled right there and Taylor talks to me and I say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it. And, oh, I can get that counseling through the EAP program, thanks. And it's better for everyone if it's handled at that level. But so behaviors of concern are the things we look for. The next concept is the concept of leakage. And that is the communication to a third party of an intent to do harm. So really here we're talking about targeted violence and folks that have actually perpetrated violence. The means can vary, but include verbal, letters, diaries, journals, blogs, videos, emails, voicemails, and other social media. So this is someone saying, hey, Taylor, if this happens, I'm going to shoot the place up. They make a comment, or they post something on social media, or they say it in an email. And more times than not, people don't take it seriously, but they call it leakage because it's their way of predicting, or they're telling you what they're going to do, but it comes out and you don't expect it. You don't expect that they'll do anything. And it is a type of warning behavior. And the statistics show that leakage occurs in the vast majority of mass murder cases. When they've looked back, you always hear, oh, they were such a nice guy, I never expected it. Then they dig into it, and there were signs there. There were certainly warning behaviors, on average like 4.7, but in most cases there was also leakage. They somehow told someone they were going to do it. And then when we look at, and you can find these online, the FBI has a number of studies. The largest one covers about 325 cases of actual mass shooters. And when we look at pre-attack behaviors or concerns of behavior, 62% of them showed some mental health concern, 57% showed some interpersonal interaction concern, 56% demonstrated leakage, 54% demonstrated issues with quality of thinking or communication, 46% issues with performance, 35% had an issue with threat or confrontation with a coworker, 33% demonstrated issues with anger, 33% some form of physical aggression, And on average, those attackers exhibited 4.7 concerning behaviors. The overwhelming majority displayed at least 2. So the way I take that home is, for all of us in the workplace, when things are going on, there are going to be signs out there. And I always say that when we had at my kids' school after the Lakeland shooting, the police did a big presentation and they talked about their response, and 90% of the presentation was all about their response and what they do. And when they said, "Are there any questions?" I raised my hand and I said, "That's great. I have no doubt that you guys will do that, but the vast majority of cases are over before the police get there. So are we going to talk about what happens before then?" And that's all these things. That's seeing these behaviors and indicators and knowing what to do and how to report and all of that. And that's really important. And statistically shown that those signs will be there. Taylor, any questions there?
So I have kind of a question. So
yeah.
You're talking about this kind of scope, right? Or this level of events that'll happen before any sort of imminent threat, right? Is there some sort of like threshold in that scale where, it's almost like a tipping point? Like if they're exhibiting these behaviors or they're doing these acts that, it's an all or nothing sort of behavior and they're going to commit some sort of violent act or whatever.
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. Yeah, we're gonna get to that. So we're gonna talk about threat assessment and some ways to do threat assessment. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about the pathway to targeted violence. So it's sort of a escalation, de-escalation path. So absolutely, and I'll get right into that. So this is something you'll see often. Now there's really 2 types of violence: effective violence and predatory violence. Effective violence is someone who's a hothead with a short fuse, impulsive. That's something that happens one time, they blow up. And predatory violence, we're talking about someone who has that grievance, the stresses they can't resolve, and they work their way up to an attack or some type of physical violence. And that's what this is for. And this is, in the world of threat management, threat assessment, this is very widely used, put together by Calhoun and Weston in 2003. So really what they say is, for that targeted violence, it starts with a grievance. They're unhappy about something. Maybe it's the manager at work that treats them differently. They're always treated worse than their peers, and they're not given a fair break. And then the violent ideation, they start thinking in their head, "Man, I'd like to just smash him in the head. I'd like to do this." And they just start thinking about that, and that takes root in their mind that violence might be the way to do it. And then they start research and planning it. So they start thinking about how they would do it. If they're going to shoot him, they think, "Oh, I could come in early in the morning and be in his office when he comes in." And then in all 3 of those, there are likely some signs, some behaviors, some things we'd see. But as we get into the next, they're actually usually physical things that they're doing. So the pre-attack preparation is, checking on, hey, what's the access like to that manager's office? Can I get there? Is there a card reader? Can I get there to hide in the office? The probing and breaches, they actually try it some morning. They're not going to do the attack that day, but they want to walk down and see if they can get in there. Or maybe it's a plant with a fence and they want to try and get in, or, all of that. And then up to and including the attack. At each step, there are signs, behaviors, things they're doing, things they're saying, things they're acquiring. We always, when we do an assessment, we look at recent acquisition of weapons, increased, if someone has weapons and goes to the range often, not necessarily a problem. But if all of a sudden they're having issues with the boss, maybe they've said something to an employee and we're kind of worried about it, and then we find out that they're talking that they've started going to the range every weekend. They've just bought 3 new guns. Like, that's a concern. So those are the things we're looking for. And through that engagement and a good threat management program, we can help de-escalate versus the escalation. So next, looking at a program, for a company, what we should be doing. And this is taken from the as-is national standard for the most part. That's the recommendation. And if you don't have that, it's the starting point. That's really the only written guidance, written standard for this. Again, it's the Workplace Violence Prevention and Intervention Standard. It's an American national standard by ASIS, which is the American Society of Industrial Security, and SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management. So every program should have workplace violence policy, employee and manager training, workplace violence and concerning behavior reporting, and we'll get into all of these a little more, but executive support, a threat management team, which we'll talk about, a threat assessment process, and then data analysis and dynamics. So looking at what's happening and looking at how you're addressing it and seeing if you're making a difference. So onto the policy. It should be a formal policy and it should be communicated. If you have 30,000 employees and you simply post your policy in an online repository amongst hundreds of other policies and expect your employees to read it, they're probably not going to, and it's probably not reasonable. And if something happens and you're on the stand and they ask you, did all your employees, were they given the policy? Did they know how to report this? That answer is probably no. It should comply with the ASIS SHRM standard, and there's a number of things in there. It should define unacceptable behavior, regulate or prohibit weapons on site, require prompt reporting, provide multiple avenues for reporting, ensure employees that their concerns will be handled with discretion, include a commitment to non-retaliation, impose discipline for violations up to and including termination, and require or encourage employees to notify you of protective restraining orders that they have obtained. So you have to have a policy and your employees have to know about it. So for training, there's a lot of ways to offer your training. You can do it in person via a learning management system posted on a website. There's a lot of third-party vendors that will do this sort of training, but your training should talk about your company policy. It should talk about behaviors of concerns and let people know what to look for. It should talk about intimate partner violence, so like domestic situations and how they affect the workplace and what to do if they are involved in something. It should talk about immediate action. So if they're in a troubling situation, what can they do? How should they react to that right away? And then how should they report it? What are the ways they can report it? And then it should also talk about run, hide, fight, or what to do if you're in a violent situation. And that differs. There's a lot of free videos and training on that, but a lot of companies don't want to talk about that. But in my experience, employees want to hear that, and they see it on the news. They've seen the videos and they've seen the signage. So the recommendation is talk about it. And then finally, it should include an overview of your threat management team, which we're going to talk about, but they should know that you have a threat management team and how they work. So when we talk about reporting, you should create an environment that nothing is too small to report and let employees know and make them feel that nothing, reporting does not mean that someone's going to be fired. It's about that engagement. It's about talking about it and dealing with it at the lowest level. It's non-retributional. They're not going to get in trouble for reporting something. And it's a way to help each other. Like we talked about a few minutes ago, if we can engage and report things early, it might just mean getting someone the help they need, either maybe through the EAP program, maybe through an HR partner, maybe it's just to help on a project. But we should have multiple avenues to report, generally through their manager, through HR, through security. Most companies have some sort of anonymous tip line, but the bottom line is make it easy for them to report, because not everybody's going to want to do the same thing. And publicize it, tell them how, but also show them that it's important to you. And then I say putting the puzzle together. So a lot of times you have one employee sees, say I'm the troubled employee. Taylor may see one thing, but maybe it's not a big deal. And Chelsea may see something else or have another interaction, and maybe that's not a big deal. But then there's 3 other people or 2 other people, and all of those things come together as puzzle pieces. And to the manager or to HR, if each one makes its way to them, they might say, okay, yeah, all of those together, I think we need to engage here. I think we need to do something. And if you do all of this, be prepared to get reports. it's more work, but you'll have a better work environment for everyone. So I know at my last company, when we started doing mass training on this, we'd have classes, and probably in most classes, someone would stay afterwards and they'd say, hey, I got one thing. Can I ask you a question? And this thing happened in the office, and we'd get cases that way. And more times than not, they weren't actual cases of violence, but they were things that people were concerned with and wanted to talk about. And they didn't do that until we started talking about it. Taylor, anything before I move on?
We actually have one question. I think that's pretty relevant. A couple of questions that I think that are pretty relevant to what you're talking about.
Okay.
One of the questions, you talked a lot about the broad scope of what a threat management program would look like and kind of some steps to put one of those together. But do you know, on average, what the annual cost for an organization to have a full-time employee in threat management program would be? Or if you don't know specifics, is there some sort of range?
Hard to say. You can do it. It doesn't have to be expensive. Most of the stuff we're talking about, I was fortunate that the company I'm with now, this is a new position that they created and funded to do just workplace violence risk management. That's not real common. At my last company, it was our security managers, it was within our life safety program that we dealt with that, and our investigators dealt with it. So in that case, they were folks we already had that dealt with investigations or employee issues, and then they dealt with the workplace violence, this threat management. So, your training, you can do it in-house. If you decide to put online training together and, make a custom video or bring someone in to do it, then it can add up. When we talk about threat assessment in a few minutes, I'll talk about having a third-party resource for that, and that can add up a little bit. But you don't have to use that on every case. So I think for the most part, by using the resources available, like the as-is standard I'm talking about, and I think it can be done effectively, fairly inexpensive. And there's a lot of through as-is and ATAP, and there's a lot of training that you can get that's not too expensive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One of the other questions that we got, I think very related to your answer from just a minute ago, how would a small business of 10 to 50 or so employees go about setting up threat management teams? Would it be more difficult, do you think, to set it up on a smaller scale?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so, because it's folks that are already there. So when I get to the slide on a threat management team, basically it's someone from security, someone from HR, someone from legal. A small company may not have an attorney already, but then it's security and HR. Maybe they, a 50-person company may not have a security person, may not. You kind of make do and you figure out who fills those roles, but they're folks at a smaller company. You're not going to have many cases, so they're not going to be dealing with this day after day. But putting the structure together on how these things are going to be managed, that's the important part. When I talk about the threat management team, you do want to put them through some training so they know what they're looking at and talking about. But there's a lot of ways to do it. Our company has, I think, close to 60,000 people, and they decided to hire someone full time to do just this. That's great. That's a lot of employees on a lot of sites. You don't always have to. There's a lot of different ways to do it.
I think that's a great point. And I think, small organizations and nonprofits are certainly pretty used to being flexible and getting creative. So I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Yeah, and there are a ton of, and I'll share some resources at the end that can help folks put this together, and it doesn't have to take a lot of money. So the next, and this is a really important one, the executive support. So you really need to set the tone for the organization, and this varies depending on the size of the organization. And at a 60,000 or 30,000 person company, you may not have the CEO who becomes your spokesperson, but maybe it's a division head at a small company. Maybe it is the owner or the president that says, hey, we're gonna put this together and it's gonna be my policy. I want to set the tone, but but you need some sort of support and someone above you saying that, hey, this is important, and I stand behind this. And I'll say that without this program or without this support, your program may not be fully realized, because I've seen this at other places that it's a great program, it's a great policy, and they try to do great training, but without that support behind it, it's likely not going to get a lot of traction, or as much traction as you could. And I would say consider a short video or a written message, even if it's a letter, a 2-paragraph letter that CEO or division head or head of HR, whoever it is, signs it and says, hey, I'm behind this. Here's how important it is, and you should be too. Real important. So now we'll talk about, so the threat management team is that team that reviews the threat assessment. So when cases or concerns come in, usually through security or HR, and then someone says, okay, this is a big deal, it goes to the threat management team. They review that threat assessment, which we'll talk about the threat, what that is in a few minutes, and then they drive that threat management plan. So the members are formally appointed. Normally means someone from HR, someone from security, someone from legal, and then you could have someone from, if you've got a really close contact with your police department and they're at your facility quite a bit. A lot of times schools will use someone from the police department, your employee assistance program, and then sometimes a business unit. If it's a manufacturing facility, maybe the head HR person from that facility will be on the team for that case. But some of that's kind of flexible. The team must be trained to understand workplace violence, threat assessment, threat management, i.e. they must all speak the same language. The team, in addition to the training, they should do some sort of tabletop simulations just to get them working together, especially, I'd say at a smaller company where maybe they're not working a lot of cases. Run through some of that stuff as a tabletop so that they know how to work together. So when the real case comes in, it's not the first time. And then they should have a written standard or procedure that says, how are they appointed? How are they called together? How are the decisions made? Is that training mandatory? And that standard kind of brings them from, it helps formalize the team. It makes them, instead of just a group of people, it makes them a team. And then I'd say your threat management team should have regular meetings, especially if they don't meet often for actual cases. When they do come together for a case, they have to know they have to be trained, they have to know the procedures, and by having regular meetings, they do that, and then they can more easily jump right into it. So threat assessment is also known as violence risk assessment or risk assessment, and according to that as-is-SHRM standard, threat assessment is investigative and analytical process followed by a professional qualified by education, training, or experience to determine the nature and level of risk of violence presented by a person and the steps that could be taken to respond to, manage, and mitigate the risk. So that's the threat management process. Threat assessment is the best available determination of the threat of violence at that present time. And I've stressed that a couple of times now, because that threat, if we do a threat assessment right now, so we take all the facts of the case, the report that came in, maybe we spoke to the manager, maybe we spoke to the employee who made the threat, maybe we've looked at video, phone logs, all that stuff. We look at it and we do the threat assessment and we say, okay, it's high risk, low risk, medium. As soon as we do something, or as soon as the situation changes, that threat assessment changes. So if we put someone on a 3-day suspension, the threat assessment changes, that risk changes. And I'll say we're not predicting violence, we're managing behaviors of concern in the present. And the way that really made sense to me when I heard this was they likened it to visiting your cardiologist. He can't tell you if you're going to have a heart attack, but he can tell you if you have indicators present that other people who have had heart attacks had present. And that's what we're doing. We're looking at a lot of the tools that we'll talk about have looked at hundreds of cases and said, okay, these cases led to violence. What was present before? And they said, okay, in most cases, this was seen. And we talked about some of that. And that's kind of what we're doing. there are a number of tools you can use, and I've seen, I would say, if possible, utilize some sort of tool, and you can get, the tools are not expensive. There are a couple of different types. There's actuarial tools and structured professional judgment. I think both have their pros and cons. And actuarial is like there's something called the Kaywood Grid. There's a company, Gavin DeBecker and Associates. They have a tool called Mosaic that basically you enter the data in, and it comes out and sort of gives you a number. And if it's 7 through 10, it's high. If it's 4 through 6, it's medium. Those are sometimes good for someone that doesn't have a lot of resources. I think the trend now, and most forensic psychologists who kind of lead this field, they would tell you that a structured professional judgment tool is the better way to go. And a structured professional judgment sometimes uses those tools, but they're using the tool as a baseline or using the data as a baseline, but then digging into it, and it's a structured way to look at that data to then make a determination on what your risk is at that time. But it also helps you by looking at it in that structured way. It helps you decide what triggers might be and what you should be concerned with, and it helps drive that threat management plan. So a few ways to do it, and there's a couple structured professional judgment tools. There's one called Waiver 21, WAVR 21. There's Rage 5 or Rage V that you can get, and some of those, like the Waiver 21 is the one we use here. You can go, if you Google that, you can go to the website. There's, I'm not sure of the exact price, but you can take an online course. I think it's like $300 to go through the initial training. And then they also offer in-person training, but you can do the online and then buy the tool. So you should have internal and an external way to do this. So there's also plenty of companies out there that have forensic psychologists, former FBI, former Secret Service, and they offer professional services for threat assessment. Recommendation is to have some way to do it internal, and then within your own policy standard, have a way to escalate that. So at some point when you say, yeah, this is really a concern, bring it to that professional, someone that deals with that all the time. And I mentioned training on your tool, and I'll say again, the shelf life, your assessment, no matter what you do for an assessment, as soon as you change, the case changes or you make a change on something, that assessment changes. So you should go back and look at that and say, okay, the person was just served with a no contact order. Did that change this assessment? Any questions on that? I know there's a lot there. Okay. So data analysis and program dynamics. So right now I track everything. We have a system, and I have an additional spreadsheet to track the target, the subject, the location, the business, the type of threat, the relationship, whether we did a threat assessment, whether we put a BOLO in place. I track all of that, and really that tracks your data, and then how to help you know if your program is effective, help you adjust your program to target threat areas. So I'm in a big company. We have a lot of divisions, so I'm tracking where the stuff's happening. I track how the cases come in. So I may say at the end of the year, we're going to do focus training for this business, or these cases are always coming in a certain way, maybe one step above where I'd want to see them. So what can I do for training that'll get that reported a little earlier? So how will you adjust your program to target threat areas? How will you show the great work you're doing? So if you're tracking this and you have this threat management team, it's, these people are doing it as an additional duty, but you're tracking everything. And at the end of the year, you can show all the work that was done. And it's always hard to show that you prevented something, because most cases are not going to lead to violence anyway. And there's no way to show that, well, if we didn't do anything, that would have led to violence. But if you can show this data on what you did, how many cases came in, and really put that together, you can really sell it up your chain of command of what you're doing and how important it is. And the last thing is you can use the data in your internal training and executive briefings. So just targeting what you're doing. So for follow-up and references, and I probably could have done 10 pages here, but the biggest one, and I mentioned this before, that as is SHRM, workplace violence prevention and intervention, that's, to my knowledge, the only actual standard in place. And the last training that I had been to, I had been told that this has been out since 2011, and I don't know of a court case yet that something happened in the workplace and then they said, did you comply with the standard? I don't know that that's happened yet, but I imagine it's only a matter of time. But this is the standard, and that goes through and explains in really good detail. It's a great resource for what your program should have. The Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, or ATAP, that's a worldwide organization. They have regional chapters. There is a New England chapter. They have great training. They host usually quarterly meetings on the subject of threat assessment, threat management. The OSHA if you just Google OSHA workplace violence, there's a ton of information on the OSHA website. If you Google FBI workplace violence or FBI active shooter, all of the FBI reports, you can get those online. If you're involved with schools at all, the next two are fantastic. From what I've seen, probably the best program in the country is out in Oregon. I think it's the Willamette Valley, but Salem, Oregon. It's the Salem Kaiser system. They put a program together and they sell a book that is and you can see the website there, but that's their program for how they manage threats at their schools there and how they do threat assessment. But that's a fantastic resource. Again, probably the best in the country. And then also Virginia, after the Virginia Tech shootings, their legislator put together a study and they put a bunch of things in place. So if you Google threat assessment in Virginia public schools, they also have a guide that you can get and download for free. And then the last couple, the SHRM, if you Google SHRM, that's the Society for Human Resources Management, Workplace Violence, or Bureau of Justice Statistics, either one of those, a ton of information comes up. And again, I probably could have had 3 more pages of references for this, but if you Google some of these things, you'll see others pop up. There's just a ton of information. And there's a lot of companies that sell these services that have more information as well. So I will tell you, before we open it completely up, I'll just say there is a roadmap and plenty of resources available to you. You're not alone. The solution is to talk about this and promote awareness amongst your leaders and employees. The majority of active shooter cases are over before the police arrive, so the difference we can make is in prevention and preparedness. And the bonus is that you'll have a happier and more productive place to work if you're addressing these issues early. And finally, I'm just going to tell you that the pushback that if you aggressively try to start a program, the pushback I would expect you'll see is that people are going to say, don't talk about it. It'll just scare people. And in my experience, it's the exact opposite. People want to talk about it. They're already scared. They see the stuff in the news. So when you talk about it, they say, yeah, that's a scary subject, but I'm glad we did it. They'll say we can't do the training. Our employees already have too much training, and then refer back to the first bullet. In my mind, this is probably one of the most important things you can talk about. So you have to convince the right people. And a lot of times you'll see if we talk about it, we have to be careful. They want to control the message and really be careful. At my last company, we really had an open forum. We had a website where employees could pose questions, and I think it was taken really well, and it gave employees a forum to talk about this. And then on the far side, you'll see, oh, we have an external consultant. We'll just refer everything there. And that's great. You're going to spend a lot of money. But when it comes to threat management and dealing with it down in the weeds at your company, you need to be involved and you need to have your team involved. It can't be done solely by an external consultant because they're not there and they don't know your company that well. So Taylor, that is all I have. What questions do we have?
So we're going to go ahead and I'll give everybody another minute or two to drop some questions in the chat box, or if you want to speak your own questions, please feel free to just raise your hand over in the participant box there, and we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly to Scott. While you guys are typing your questions, if you have any, I think, Scott, just another big thank you for coming and speaking with us today. I think you've done a phenomenal job of humanizing threat management, not only, I think it's something that we overlook when we're doing our planning, is that the human component to that threat management. The resources you provided were phenomenal, and like you said, I'm sure that there's plenty more out there, but we'll at least provide these slides, and like you said at the beginning, this presentation will be recorded, so you can go back and watch it and look at the slides that way as well. And I think it's also nice because you set some really realistic expectations for developing a threat management program, and the values that we should expect to see in return for developing a threat management program. So I appreciate that. I think that a lot of people can be intimidated if it's something that they haven't done yet. I think it's kind of an intimidating process. So I think you definitely.
And they're doing it anyway, Taylor. Like when a threat comes in at a company, if you don't have a program, you're still doing it. You're just kind of blindly feeling your way through it. So if you spend a little time beforehand, just like anything, just like any emergency management concept, think about it and have a little bit of a plan, and you're going to react better.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. That's an excellent point. Yeah, we are already doing it, right? So it doesn't look like we have any questions or any more questions, I guess. Thank you for submitting some questions throughout the length of the presentation. I think that was great. Like I said, we'll be providing these slides and the recording of the webinar on the IAEM Region 1 page. So please feel free to go there for more information as well. And Scott, it looks like you've got your email up there if people would like to reach out to you as well.
Absolutely. Sure.
Thank you again, Scott, and thank you everyone for attending today. I know we're all very busy, but this is an incredibly valuable piece of information I think that Scott was able to give us today. So thank you again. And please, if anyone has any questions after the fact, don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Scott. We'll point you in the right direction.
Thank you so much for doing this today.
Yeah,
Thanks, everybody.
Of course. All right. Thanks, everybody. Please take care.
Thanks.